just immortal beings in small bodies. They need to be held responsible like the rest of us.
Promise to help get ethics in on this planet and universe, which is the basic purpose of the Sea Org.
You need to stop committing these overts. This better not come up in your next session.
I promise to accept and fulfill to the utmost of my ability the responsibilities entrusted to me, whatever they may be, and wherever they may carry me in the line of duty.
I don't want to hear it. Write up your OWs.
I promise through my actions to increase the power of the Sea Org and decrease the power of any enemy.
You can't just leave.
Protecting the church is more important than family.
Welcome back to the Children of Scientology channel. I'm Christi Gordon, and I'm joined by my partner, Mirriam Francis, both raised in Scientology, as we continue exploring and exposing Scientology for children. Today, we continue our Cadet Org series, which is a look back at what it was like to be born in or trafficked into Scientology's Sea organization as a child, given no options or safe off-ramp. Once there, your only future is to be hammered into an asset and a future Sea Org member for 1 billion years. Trigger warning, we are discussing trauma in various forms, so if you need to pause this video and pick it back up later, please do so. On behalf of all children raised in Scientology, we appreciate you being here and helping us spread the message that Scientology is not appropriate for children. Scientology does not believe in childhood. This is dangerous. Today, we have a really special guest, Mike Brown, who was also raised in and whose mom joined the Sea organization when he was a child. He lived through a couple of iterations of Cadet Orgs and was groomed to and finally did pledge to a 1 billion-year contract to the Sea Org himself with a lot of ups and downs that he has agreed to share with us today before he eventually escaped and then successfully found a new life, a career, and a family. Now he's bravely circled back. So welcome, Mike. We're just incredibly honored to have you today.
Thank you very much for having me. I very much appreciate you having me on.
I've been so excited to meet you, Mike. I think that the things that you've talked about publicly, definitely dear to my heart. Yeah, topics like disconnection and the effects on vulnerable people. And I really felt like you, not only both you and your mother, dived into your own personal stories, but also broadened that out to how does that affect other people that are still in that situation. And those are the things that we're really interested in. You know, we want to look back at the past and see what we can learn from it and also expose the abuses that happened. But we also need to have a look at, is that still in play today and how does that affect people? So your story and your mother, Rosemary's story, has been really great to see. And I also feel like you just carry that with so much compassion and just beautiful to watch. Yeah.
Well, thank you for those kind words. It's a little overwhelming. Wasn't, expecting quite that intro, but thank you so much. This is something that it's been important for me to start to share because like so many people, we've probably put a pin in our stories from the things that happened to us when we were kids or our experiences when we were in Scientology, or for a lot of people, I think that watch these shows, they maybe weren't even in Scientology. Maybe they were just in a bad relationship or another kind of organization that's similar. And to bring these things up, it's cathartic, but at the same time, it's a lot to process. And I think it's important because if we look back at sharing our story, my hope in both sharing my story here with you and also the things that I've done with my mother to blow the whistle on the senior abuse is so that we shine some sunlight on those dark spots and hopefully it kind of helps sterilize them. Our hope is that my mother's isn't going to be the only story of being able to have a family reunited and get people out of there. But I would like to see that replicated, although I think it's going to be hard. But I think if we start applying pressure, things will eventually get better. So we'll see.
Well, Mike, you know what I find really interesting is that the three of us, all of us, we were placed into this system at very young ages or born into it, which we didn't have any choice over. And then we were raised and groomed for this specific purpose. What's interesting is, we were in those positions where we had no choices, and we eventually got out. And it's like our generation has to come back and save our parents. Our parents got us into it, I'll admit that I don't have that same connection to my mother, but I just find it's interesting. We have to come back because that vulnerability has come full circle now. It was vulnerable children, and now it's the vulnerable elderly, and to shine a spotlight on that too. But we are really interested in diving into your story, which started at a very young age. What age did you arrive into like the Cadet Org system? When did your mother start in the Sea Org?
So my parents, when they were married, we lived in Colorado and just outside of Denver. I was about 7 years old when they got involved in Scientology. And between the ages 7 and 10, they were doing services out in Denver between the Denver mission and the Denver organization there, the Class 5 organization. And then my parents split up. My father cheated on my mother, kind of left us both and ran off with this other woman. And she was left more or less as a single mom. And he was the one that got us into Scientology, which was strange. He's a Vietnam veteran, formerly in the military, came back from Vietnam with a lot of both mental trauma and physical trauma. He had gotten very badly injured, and he was always looking for kind of a self-help solution to anger issues and pain and PTSD and things that service members today deal with, that same thing. So he was trying to self-help his way through that. And he had already done the yoga kick where I remember when I was a little kid walking into his bedroom and he's standing on his head naked. And I'm like, okay, I don't need that. I'm going to walk out. Because TMI, Dan. But he was on this, yeah, he was on the Scientology kick when he then left my mom. So, and this is what's so incredibly heartbreaking and strange about the way things are in the Sea organization was my mother has very strong maternal instincts. She, I would say, is above average in her desire to care for people and to also care for me. And she originally got into the Sea organization thinking that she was going to get into this very wholesome, church oriented group, and it was going to be a very positive upbringing for her son. She got into it for me. And then it's like that assembly line as soon as you arrive. So we ended up arriving out there when I was 10 years old. It was probably, I think, 87 or so when we actually got there. And it was complete and total shock from our previous life on the way things were, because it was a very middle class environment where we lived. There was a lot of, I had my toys and I had the whole upbringing, which is not the same as what we ended up finding ourselves in as soon as you become a Sea Org member. She went immediately onto the estates project force, and her being a fairly green Scientologist, it took her like 4 or 5 months. And in that time, I was just living in that fountain building on the cadet coordinator's floor and and it was a roach infested, horrible building. I really hated the place. And I went from this kind of middle class life which was a lot of trauma, but then moving out there and then spending my days at the Cadet Org, the Apollo Training Academy, a little courtyard crappy spot that I think they use now for kind of their grounds or estates division or painting or something across from what used to be Bridge Publications. That's where we would spend double our time. Yeah. So I was just dumped into the middle of it. Somebody told me that I'm supposed to start cleaning and I said, okay. And I started getting yelled at because I didn't say sir. And they're screaming at me about not having my FO38 in. And I didn't even know what any of those things meant. So
How would you know?
Yeah. So as a 10-year-old, I was this was when we still had a little bit of family time. So she would see me maybe for like a half hour a day. And she would take me down to, what was it, George's General Store?
Yeah, on the corner by the ATA.
And as a cadet, you weren't allowed to have anything with sugar in it. Like you couldn't have sugar. You could have all the other stuff. So we'd go down there, and if anyone saw you with sugar, it was like you're robbing a bank. That's how bad it was to have sugar. But I quickly found out that anything that this guy that we were now dedicating ourselves to said was, it was taken as the most important information, no matter how mundane it was. And it was trying to adapt to that was very strange now in the middle of a big city when I had never been in that situation before. So I was very confused. I kind of felt like that for probably the first year that we were there. I was just trying to kind of get through day at a time.
Like completely disorientated. Yeah.
Yeah. It was
We
strange.
built a little presentation to go along with this conversation. Do you mind if I add it so we can kind of show that? And again, we're new friends, so I built this based on what I think your experience was because we have a lot of commonalities. So if anything's off, you tell me, but I'm going to just add this. So because I think it supports exactly what you're saying. So is this you prior to the Sea Org?
So this is when we're living in Colorado. You see that haircut? That's just on point. I'm pretty sure that is a straight up bowl cut.
The Buster Brown. No, I don't know what it
Yeah,
is.
that's the real deal.
That's
But yeah, this is us is when we were in Golden, Colorado, and when I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And yeah, that's my mom. And Christmas time. I don't know what exact year it was, but you can see it's fairly suburban, middle class, typical
totally.
white boy upbringing. So that's what I went from.
Compared to the Sea Org, it's very Norman Rockwell. I love it.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
and then we ended up
this is
basically a little bit later when we're actually up at the Ant Ranch. So
this is the Ant Ranch. Okay, so we
yes,
jumped
that's
in.
the Ant Ranch. So and that's okay. When we were in Los Angeles, and I've if I won't try to focus too much on my mother's story, just so we can focus on all
Yeah,
this.
absolutely.
There's this big complex building, and that is where we lived. Actually, the building that we lived in, the bottom right corner, I think that is the corner of the Fountain Building where we
Mhm.
slept.
I think
And they
this
use that for something
tower,
now. I don't know what.
the AC on the bottom corner might be the
Hmm.
top of the Fountain Building.
That was my question in looking back at things from documents from the 80s and early 90s. There was a mention of the Fountain Building, whereas I arrived 1990, and I was, after the CEO was like fell apart or whatever, which was next to the CC, they then put a bunch of us into the Anthony Building, which is also on Fountain. So I was always curious, like, do they
Here.
mean the Anthony Building when they say Fountain Building? But you're talking about an earlier building.
So directly
Right.
across Fountain Avenue, across from AOLA, and right there on the corner across from L. Ron Hubbard Way is the building they refer to as the Fountain Building. And that was where a lot of staff were housed in there. A 2D room where people with children, I think, were there. They also would sometimes bus them over to the Holiday Inn, the HI building, or the Wilcox, depending on where you stayed. But I was sleeping in there for a while. They ended up having to move everybody out of the Fountain Building because I think in 88 or 89, there was an earthquake. It kind of rocked this whole area, and that Fountain Building was not earthquake proofed. They had to do the whole thing where they put the big bolts through the walls and kind of hold the building together. So they had to move everybody out of that.
Retrofitting, yeah.
And as a result, they moved people into the Anthony Building, which is probably about 4 or 5 blocks to the off screen to the left, down
Yeah.
is where the Anthony Building is. Or if they were
Right.
kind of more of an executive, they moved them onto Edgemont Street, which if
Mm.
you go down probably 2 blocks and then hang a right, there's a apartment complex at Edgemont where executives would stay. And I
Mm.
remember like the Miscaviges were there and the Renders and stuff. That's where their family lived, in the Edgemont Building.
Well, so interesting.
So
Yeah.
my mother worked down here, and we would get occasionally. I see you have the thing in here on family time. So
Mhm.
you would eat dinner. I think it was around between 5 and 6 was family time, and at which point the adults would go back to work after all that was done, and then the kids would go back to the Cadet Org and do whatever we're supposed to do in the evenings, like cleaning stations and whatever other work they're having us do, and then we would sleep on cots in the ATA until hopefully our parents came and picked us up at some point. And sometimes
Oh
they
my
would, and sometimes they
goodness.
wouldn't. So
We have these copies of these documents that were squirreled out by parents over the years as they left, and that we have so many. It's just this treasure trove of atrocities, which is it's really heartbreaking to look at them, and it's also it's very reinforcing because it feels a little bit like there's no proof, and so maybe what happened to you didn't happen, and maybe you're imagining it. And so many people don't believe these stories because they're so outrageous. So it's been really brilliant to find the evidence that some parents took with them very intelligently. And so, anyways, so what you're talking about, these moves from building to building are actually documented in some of these. And I will have to give the credit to a guy named Lawyer Mark Plummer, has been this historian and shared these children's documents with us for
that's
years.
great.
So I was in the Cadet Org. Let's see, we arrived to Pac Base and we're at the Melrose, which is just prior to the Fountain Building, which was a little farther away from the complex. And there was always an hour of family time that I recall. It had been in place for years since, I don't know, I guess it started on the ship. I've not seen that in writing, but then we went to Flag. We had an hour of family time.
In Australia, at the same time, they also had 1 hour family time. My mother has mentioned about 1 hour family time. It was also dinner evening time as well. So what we're trying to say is that this is uniform across the world in every Sea Org organization, location. Yeah.
And so in 1989, they decided that it was not a policy. And so they took it away with the carrot of it's not really beneficial to your family to just spend an hour. And also, by the way, it interrupts production, which is the most important thing, really.
Yeah,
But
totally.
so instead, you should CSW for liberty every 2 weeks. And we all know how often people get liberty. If your
Oh,
ethics are out, if you're
absolutely.
in a
All the
lower
time.
condition, if your stats are down, you're
Mhm.
not going to get it. If your org is down, like there's so many reasons why you would not get a every 2 week liberty. But this basically is this carrot saying, oh, and you can just spend the whole day with them every 2 weeks, which we all know is baloney.
And less than 10% of the time, you would actually get time off.
Totally.
And that's
Absolutely.
probably, probably less than that is what it actually ended up. I can probably remember, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 times in 3 years that I had a day off with my mother, like a Sunday off.
And this is super early. It's 1971 because I wanted to point out that they already had a plan to separate parents from children from very far back. Like that creating these ranches was actually a conversation that was happening. They're talking about LA is not a good environment for children. They're going to be surrounded by mixed people. I don't know what the hell that means. Druggists and out 2D. The language is hilarious. But anyways, putting you in the fresh air in Mexico was their first idea. They wanted to send you guys to Mexico and put you in Quonset huts. And they did actually briefly have a ranch in Mexico that had one nanny and I understand 40 kids. And then they had local Mexican folks that were coming in to help out. And there was really a lot of harm done to kids, including sexual abuse, including scorpion, just bad, not protected circumstances. So
But
my
not only are
point
they
is,
moving them across state lines,
yeah,
they're moving them internationally. So
to
this is
another
straight up
country.
children's trafficking. Like,
Mm.
It is.
it's
Anyway,
bad.
so my point was that they eventually stuck you guys in a ranch far away from your parents is so not a surprise. It was an agenda all along. As we go through these policies, and I didn't include them here, there's repeated warnings about children are not to live with their parents. Children are not to live with their parents. Children are not to be near their parents on post. Children are not to disrupt production. And they're talking about cadets or children. They're just saying basically what you're saying. They were a nuisance all along, and they knew that. And I imagine 1996, you guys probably remember this, and this is basically when they're restructuring and admitting to the fact that they never should have had children in the Sea Org, that it was never a place for small children, and that it took parents off production lines. And so it basically was a distraction to the purpose of the Sea organization, and that they had tried and tried to accommodate children, and yet it was expensive, it was not safe. Like, they're basically admitting this was fucked up all along for children, right? But mostly, that's the important part is it interrupted the goal of this group.
What's so
So that
hypocritical
was.
about this? This is
Mhm.
Guillaume Lasserre that actually pinned this. I don't know if it was written by him or by David Miscavige or whoever, but you can see
Mm,
down there on the
mhm,
CSI AVC GL, that's Guillaume Lasserre. He was the EDant
mm,
and I think is
mhm,
probably still is. He had 2 children that were at the International Ranch when this came out. So when this
Mhm.
policy was enacted, he himself is a father. So that just talking about the inhumanity and the lack of parental involvement, this is coming from a guy who has 2 daughters that are
mm,
like maybe elementary to middle school age. And
mm,
he's the one that is penning this policy letter that's being sent out to the entire organization. It's just
Mhm.
creepy. Yeah.
But do you feel like it was Dave
Absolutely.
Miscavige writing it basically, just using
I wouldn't be surprised. I know, like when we were at the international ranch, eventually, yes, we went up to, and I was at that international ranch after my mother had already been moved up to Int, and then eventually we had, were sent up there to create that It ranch. It was basically 8 of us kids. That when we can get onto more details on that, but Guillaume would come out for the renovations. He's up at Int every Saturday. You do base renovations. It's like area beautification, like the entire property jumps
Mhm,
on board and you kind of work on renos and grounds and the whole thing. It's like an LRH advice for that actual property itself. Um,
Mhm.
but he would come out to the ranch and every time I would see him with his daughters, he seemed like a loving father. It seemed like he was interested in his daughter's well-being. And you can see if you read through the entirety of this, which I think that people would probably tune out the second we did if we went through all the blah, blah. But pretty much it says it's not in the organization's best interest production wise. And that's the main reason why they're doing it. It's not because it's not good for the kids. That's actually not the tone of this at all. It's that it's not good for the organization.
Right.
So,
No. Yeah.
And really, the intention for this was to move those children who were cadets in towards being in the Sea Org, start prepping them like we're going to put them in the Sea Org because they're Thetans in little bodies. They said this line here, a Thetan is simply a Thetan. Body size has nothing to do with it. And so really, and then over the next, it was still about at least 3 years later, maybe 4 years after this, 1996, so about 4 years later, that the ranches, the Int Ranch and the Pack Ranch were completely disbanded, as in all of those children, most of them have been put in the Sea Org. There was like maybe a very small amount, just a few kids that refused and then were just, sent away.
offloaded.
Yeah. And actually, a couple of the kids from the Int Ranch, they refused to be in the Sea Org. They were just kept at Pack under security for a little while. These were a couple of the younger girls who had Int executive parents, and they just sort of didn't know what to do with them, but they didn't put them in school or anything like that. They just hung around Pack. And because I was on the decks at the time, so we would all just hang out together. I was trying to leave the Sea Org by then, and whole
And
mess. Mhm.
what's been interesting is my mom, Rosemary, and I have had a lot of um, productive and hard conversations about the subject of caring for your kids, because anytime we talk about all the stories that have to do with the ranches, the cadet organizations, the thing that is omitted from all of those conversations is the parents. The parents are the most omitted part of any interaction with the children. And now that I have kids, like my kid gets home from school and she's in a bad mood. I'm like, what happened at school? Like I'm like grilling her. Do I need to talk? Do I need to get involved? Dad, stay out of it, kind of stuff. But we're involved on an hourly basis with what our children are doing. Not that we're like helicopter parents, but we just are interested. And that's about little nitpicky details. But what we're talking about, hey, they don't want to be here. Well, let's send them down to Los Angeles and put them under security. Like that one statement in itself, you're like, what? So when the conversation Laura and I had, the whole subject of spankings that would occur at the ranch as these adults that are being put in charge of these kids that are not their kids are being given this authority to discipline children. And it's part of their policy. There's LRH advices and policies that support that. I'm not saying that it's correct, but from from the idea of a Sea Org member, it's their duty to follow policies. So there's a lot of allowance for a lot of abuse. So as such, that's not their problem. If a kid is misbehaving at a certain point, if you can't reason with them in a school environment, the parents are supposed to do something about it. And our parents never were ever involved. And I'll go into some details about how uninvolved my mother and my father were about some really important things in my life that I was just made to flounder in for years.
Yeah, I would say as
Okay.
well is that there's care and nurture, like from a parent, like what you're talking about, an awareness, a keenness to know what's happened in your day. I love you, I care about you. Those are fantastic qualities. We want to see that in parenting. But the most basic, even way below that, is just responsibility. You have a child, you've given birth to a child, they're your responsibility. What the Sea Org did is completely remove that responsibility. Not only that, they said that your interaction is a cross order because this is the Cadet Org. The Cadet Org commands what the children do and what their structure is and what their schedule is, and you don't interfere. Now, that is a parental responsibility. They should never, ever have given up that. And what they did, I think, is just that alone, that basic responsibility was the most damaging because that allowed all the other things to happen. So they gave up their responsibility as though those children were being put into a system, which really actually was a labor force. So it's like putting your kids into adoption for, it's just labor trafficking. Anyways, it's just so wild. Yeah.
You guys said yesterday asset and asset management, and that really was, and that's what LRH says, that cadets were assets, you were producing future assets for the Sea Org, future Sea Org members, contributing assets, blah, 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 and anything to handle you was asset management. It was not child care. It wasn't any of those things. And also a thing that you guys mentioned when we were just talking to Catherine Spillino is that all of these policies, the parents were CC'd on so that they would have an awareness of it. But they had, like, there were parent councils from time to time, and they would get canceled, and someone would create a thing where the parents would be involved, but then they would cancel it and also report the parents for being squeaky wheels or making too much
Right.
noise about their child's care. So it was really a schizophrenic situation. They did take away the parental right to the child. The child was suddenly Sea Org property, period. And then, but
Yeah.
sometimes they would blame the parents, like, you didn't take liberty with them. You're responsible. The law says you can go to jail if you abandon your child. And yet here you are over here going, get on post, get your stats up. You're not supposed to be concerned with your child. We own your child. So it was really a very crazy push pull of what to do. And so I don't know how anyone could have navigated it. I don't know how anyone could have navigated it. It was like an
No, and I
impossible
think
situation.
It was an impossible situation. Yeah.
here's what I was getting around to is the fact that there's a legal responsibility. When you give birth to a child, you have a legal responsibility. You can't, if you dump them on the side of the road and you drive off, they're not going to survive. They'll die. And you cannot, there's no legal thing that says, oh, you can just put them into a child system that is going to groom them and create a labor force for
Mhm.
this. Anyway, it's so wild. What I'm trying to say is that, Mike, I really agree with you that there is a parental responsibility and a right that they consented to. Sorry, I'm putting words in your mouth.
I
What I
agree.
want to say is that, so there's the involvement of the Sea organization where, yes, they had the structure and they had all of that. But what I was really relating to is you saying that the parents were missing from the picture. That ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the parental responsibility to where you put your children and what you put them through. And that's their failing.
They're straight up saying in here, like, how demanding the lifestyle is for the Sea Org. This is very telling in terms of what you're getting your kid into. And they're all but saying this is not an environment for children. And
Yes.
they're saying that children are basically adults in little bodies. And that is one of the major issues that went on with the way that children were treated. And right along with that, no one at any time with any of us ever asked us the one question, which I think is probably the most important thing that you can ask a kid as you're trying to nurture them as they're growing up is, what do you want to do when you grow up? I usually ask my kids that like all the time, like, hey, what are your interests? Like, what do you want to do when you grow up? Let's use Laura for an example. She loves art and music and stuff. She probably would have loved to be one of the musicians. No one probably even gave that to her as an option. But there were a lot of kids that were very talented, and a couple of them ended up being used in Golden Era Productions because it is so unique as an organization to do specific types of creative work. But in a standard organization like down in PAC, I can only imagine no one gave a shit what you wanted to do with yourself. You were going to plug into the organization somewhere, and it was never an option. And if you ever wanted to not do that, there was something wrong with you, would be the response of the organization and your parents for that. What do you guys think about that?
100%.
Yeah, you were a cog, and you didn't get any choice. I think Mirriam actually said in her Aftermath episode, you made reference to that you wanted to either write or you wanted a hobby. You just had this desire to do something else just as a side supportive, creative thing, and you were not allowed to. That was not an option. You weren't given any choices. There was no free will whatsoever. Um, and then I just want to mention there's this reference that I think I never knew about that existed supposedly on the ship, and I have a copy of it, but I didn't include it. It was LRH saying, every child must be told this. If you do not want to be here, you do not have to be here. And then they were supposed to make other arrangements for you. If you are receiving auditing on someone else's determinism, you do not have to. Did you ever hear any of that? Did anyone ever say that
I
to
think
you
maybe
when you were a
about the
kid?
auditing, like you had to want auditing. I think that might have been a thing, but at the same time, well, I think that's good. What are your two options? For instance, what does that mean? If both of your parents are in the Sea Org and you don't want to be there,
That's what I was going to add to that, Mike, is to say, yes, so there's two things. So first of all, you're never given anything as an option. I didn't know that I could just leave. There was actually a sign near the entrance of the ATA building. It was a little copy in a frame of that exact reference, Christy.
Oh.
And I'd pass by that and see that. So I was aware that sort of reference existed. But in reality, it did not. Because, first of all, where are you going to go? And you're not being given an education. You're being indoctrinated and groomed for Scientology through all these Scientology communication, like the children's communication course and these children's books and that are geared to pull the child more and more in and push this help button. Oh, don't you want to help? Are you a person that helps people? Do you like helping people or you don't like helping people? And what does that mean? And anyway, so all this grooming is taking place. So yes, there's a sign on the door that says that. There's a reference in a book somewhere. But in actual reality, you're being groomed for a life in the Sea Org, and you know that. I knew that as a kid. So then let's say you do work up the nerve or the smarts to say, hey, I don't want to be here. The sign says that I can just leave. Well, they're going to pop you into the governess group and then they're going to work you and work you because ethics then gets applied. And the ethics is the sort of like the system to keep you on the rails.
Because the rule is the only reason you would want to leave something is because you have overts and withholds. So crimes. It's the only reason you would want to leave are your own overts and withholds. And so, yeah.
There's a lot of control mechanisms and constructs and stuff that they'll put in place. And all of these they're basically just guide rails that are moving you in one direction. And if you try to go outside of those, they'll keep pushing you back to that center point. And the language is very controlling. All of the day to day and what you're doing, the information that you're being provided as a kid, you're not getting a normal education. It's all very tailored to groom you to be beholden to this organization and not educated, because it's actually in their best interest, if they're creating their own people, that they only educate them in the things that they want them to focus on so that they have little drones. That's really what they want. And they use all this very inflammatory and exciting language and all this symbolism and things that make it look like you're being involved in something that is larger than life. And a lot of the propaganda, I think, is just, it's supposed to entice young people who are trying to establish an identity for themselves to plug into something and to identify with it. And they start that very young and they lay it on heavy.
Another thing they lay on, Mike, is the guilt. So they apply the shame, they apply the fear, and then they also apply the guilt. Oh, but if you say that you want to leave or you try and leave, then that's going to be you're going to create a problem for your parents. Do you want to create a problem for your parents? Is that what you're trying to do? Are you trying to stop the saving of mankind? You don't want a cleared planet? Like, it just gets heavier and you're like, oh God, no. And it comes back to do you want to be a good guy or you want to be a bad guy? No kid wants to be a bad guy. Like, we want to be the good guy in the story, don't we? And so all of this is applied to this load on the child. And yeah, awful.
Okay. It's not to say there's not a load on the parents as well. There's a huge load on the parents, but I feel like our parents were looking for guardrails. And we were going, no, and pushing on the guardrails constantly. The kids were the ones that were pushing back against these rules that we didn't care for or didn't like. So it's such a weird disparity and kind of conflict of interest.
Yeah. But then with that, and I agree, but then it was left to the organization to deal with us when we didn't want to follow the rules. So we were never able to go to our parents and say, hey, I really don't want to be a Sea Org member when I grow up. And then you're not then going to deal with the parents, that conversation. The organization is going to deal with you. And it's not for the parents to decide, it's for the organization to decide.
Cadets reported to an MAA, an ethics officer, and were disciplined. And children were disciplined at leisure by a governess. They got to choose what your punishment was. And cadets had MAAs and ethics officers, and you were not allowed to speak offline to your parents about any of this stuff. So they couldn't advocate for you.
Yeah. Even in this paragraph here, it's talking about for cadets, there is a training lineup which not only utilizes LRH study tech to provide them a sound basic education. There's a lot to talk about on that. The dumpster fire that is reading, writing, and arithmetic in this year, but also trains them up to at least class 5. And then utilizing the tools of the golden age of tech. Thank you, David Miscavige. They will arrive on post as perfect auditors, and most will have co-audited to the state of clear. So
that never happened.
Like, as children, all that shit never happened. We never got a good education. But the perfect solution for them is we're going to kind of give you, what do they say? A sound basic education. I'm sure that there's a lot of the states in the United States and in any country would say, hey, we're just after a sound basic education here, people. because that's well defined. But then they're very clear to define all the Scientology indoctrination to the point of making you an auditor as a child. That they 100% say that right here. That's what we
Well,
want for you.
completely. That's absolutely right. And through the years, see these references, things have changed, but some things have changed, but the core of it never changed. And this type of writing is there through the 80s, the policies through the 90s. This is now 96, but this is the tail end, getting towards the tail end of the closing of these cadet organizations. But that type of rhetoric is right there through from the beginning of the Cadet Org, right the way through. It was always was the intention to train these children up, to only ever give them the most basic form of education, to basically so that they could be literate, so that they could perform the functions of the positions they would then hold in the Sea organization. Let's say if a child says to a parent, I don't really want to be, hey, mom, I don't really want to be there. She would write a report and then turn that conversation over to the Sea organization to handle. Ultimately, either way, whether the kid speaks up within the Cadet Org or he speaks up to a parent, the organization will be the handlers of it. Now, the organization has a vested interest in keeping not only the parent, but also the child, because they're an asset. So we don't want to let you go. We're not willing to let you
Cheap
go.
labor, almost free labor.
Trafficking of children involves recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, receipt of children for the purpose of exploitation. Child exploitation may involve forced labor, slavery, servitude, debt bondage. Child labor is a form of work that may be hazardous to the physical, mental, spiritual, moral, or social development of children, and it can interfere with education, development, and psychological well-being. If you or someone that you know has been human trafficked, help is available. There will be more information at the end of this presentation. Thank you.